We're shifting into this multipolar sphere of influence view of world politics, whereby the US, Russia, China draw a clear line and say, this area is something we simply won't allow the UN to have any kind of authority over.
I'm really interested in this question of whether the Security Council is broken or not, or whether this is really a reflection of countries finding their voice.
Recognizing Palestine now is probably not going to be extremely effective. It's not going to make Israel change its present policy, but it is most we can do at the moment.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Celebrating 80 are the words that greet you on the United Nations website. And yet, in the year that the organization celebrates its 80th anniversary, it is in anything but a celebratory mood. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres sought to rally support at the General Assembly in New York this week, saying, "In this moment of crisis, the United Nations has never been more essential. The world needs our unique legitimacy, our convening power, our vision to unite nations, bridge divides, and confront the challenges before us." The question is, how many still believe that? His host certainly doesn't seem to. What is the purpose of the United Nations? President Donald Trump asked during his speech of almost an hour in New York. To answer that question and to explore the challenges to order in the world, I'm joined by Marc Weller, Professor of International Law at Cambridge University, who is going to head Chatham House's International Law Programme from next week. Also by our Associate Fellow, Christopher Phillips, Professor of International Relations at Queen Mary, University of London. We're going to talk about whether the UN is dead, whether that matters, whether it can be fixed, and we're going to look at the Middle East, where the UN has failed to help bring an end to conflict, but several countries used the General Assembly week to pronounce that they were recognizing Palestine. And we'll talk about where next. Are there going to be rules of the world? Whose will they be? Will the UN be part of those? Marc, let me start with you. When Trump asked, what is the purpose of the United Nations? He followed it up by saying, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then they never follow that letter up. It's empty words. Empty words don't solve wars. Is he right?
Well, not really. The UN has a huge amount of functions. If President Trump were to look at the daily agenda on any day of the year of what the UN actually does, it is an amazing range of things that is going on. The Secretary General has pointed to the convening power, but there are so many routine functions and things where international life is being advanced through conferences, meetings, and actual decisions. But we do have to accept, I think, that the UN is not like the EU. It's not a supranational organization that can decide things. The UN is a creature of its member states, and it's the servants of the member states. And only if the states are willing to use that facility will it be able to generate decisive action. The UN Security Council is pretty much blocked on many of the more major issues, although even there, actually, the Council is fairly active on a number of conflicts where there isn't an automatic veto. President Trump has referred to the peacemaking function. He is, to some extent, right. I think the Trump administration has been successful in a few cases, not necessarily all the 7 he is invoking, but a range like India, Pakistan, which was very quick and quite impressive, and 1 or 2 others. But then again, Ukraine has been a failure. On Gaza, some might argue that the US has contributed to the extension of the conflict rather than its termination by giving a carte blanche, perhaps in some way, to Israel. And generally, the activity of making peace has really changed over the 20 years. It's no longer either the UN or the US or a major power doing it. If you look at the Colombian peace deal or the Philippines, you have a coalition of NGOs, of regional organizations, individual states, and all sorts of others who now work together to generate peace arrangements. So it is more difficult.
That's really, really interesting about the nature of peacemaking things, which I want to come on to, and also to pick up what you were saying about the Security Council, which we'll spend a moment on. But you make a really important point right at the beginning. I'm glad you made it at the beginning, which is that we shouldn't forget how much works and that was sort of created by the UN and works under its auspices. It's like my favorites are the Telecommunications Union, the Postal Union, and the fact that you post a letter and it broadly gets to the other end by international agreement that planes take off and land, and all that takes a degree of cooperation which the world is still happy to keep going. Chris, I want to pick up this point about the Security Council because you don't get very far in talking about the UN without talking about the way the Security Council is jammed, and it is supposed to be one of the mechanisms for enforcing international law. What does that do to the standing of international law and being able to, say, stop countries invading others by force?
Well, as Marc says, it's a product of the power dynamics that actually are baked into the UN. It was designed by FDR to give the five great powers of the world as they were then the opportunity to exercise a degree of sphere of influence politics. That's how it was originally designed. That's when the introduction of the veto allowed for a degree of great power politics. And at moments in which those great powers aren't getting on, that leads to logjams. That's the nature of the creature that was created. What's is interesting is what's happening at the moment is we have seen a shift in global power dynamics over the last 15 years or so. So previously, in what many might see as a golden era of UN activity in the 1990s, you had that era of unipolarity where the US was the unquestionable dominant power in the world, and there were very few states willing to stand up to it. So from perhaps an American perspective, perhaps Donald Trump's perspective, that was a time when the UN was quote unquote working because a lot of things were happening under UN auspices. It's not happening now.
And the US didn't get everything through. It didn't get all it wanted on Iraq through when it chose to go to war there, but it did get quite a lot of support.
It did, absolutely. And that is the shift. And in many ways, 2003 in the Iraq War was the moment that saw the world begin to turn, because you saw a world that was no longer willing to be, for want of a better word, dominated or at least led by the US. And since then, you've seen this resurgent China, resurgent Russia being far more willing to stand up to the US at the UN. Critics would argue that the US themselves have begun the process of undermining the UN by their own use of vetoes. But in many ways, as I say, that's how it's designed. It's designed to allow these great powers to protect, quote unquote, their interests. And when you have those powers criticizing and conflicting with one another, you're going to get a logjam.
So, Marc, what does this do to the ability to enforce international law, international agreement, even some of these very fundamental principles, like one country should not invade another by force and expect to go unpunished? And that goes right back to the founding charters of the UN and even before that.
Yes, it's not really just whether or not the UN Security Council can adopt a resolution that condemns a particular use of force or adopts even sanctions or military measures. As we heard, it's the consensus broke down starting, I think, with Kosovo in 1999, indefinitely, as Chris said, in 2003, and amplified after Libya, when the Russians took the view that the Western states had misused a UN mandate to topple Colonel Gaddafi. But the other issue is really the credibility of the underlying prohibition of the use of force, which is meant to be enforced by the Security Council. And there, I think we have to accept that there have been really significant challenges. There have been new proposed justifications for the use of force, the so-called doctrine of the unwilling or unable state. If a state itself doesn't remove a terrorist place from its territory, then we can use missiles or other devices, air forces, to attack and remove them. A stretching of what self-defense means in relation to terrorist threats and other measures. And there the West itself has contributed a little bit to that phenomenon, which then has been picked up recently by Israel, but before that by Turkey and others. The Russians have been so happy to play back the Western rhetoric about Kosovo and other instances when invading Ukraine entirely unlawfully under totally different circumstances. So our own sins sometimes come to haunt us, and it is time to work on a new, slightly more realistic consensus on when force is actually legitimate, given that the threshold, the impetus to use force with drones, missiles, has been much reduced. The sort of threshold to war is far less than it was 10 years ago.
That's a really interesting point. You mean that just by sending a drone, you're doing something very provocative, as Russia has done in the past few weeks, most recently over Denmark, it appears. and that so the threshold of hostile action in a way has dropped down. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, previously it was clear that if you send a military aircraft into another state's territory, that actually was already a use of force to which you can apply self defense. But with this sort of lowering of the threshold, that if I send a drone that knocks out a terrorist center here or there in Pakistan or somewhere, it's not really a warlike act. It's just something one
Yeah.
happens to do nowadays. So, what actually is, in quotation mark, a war and what isn't, or in legal terms, what is an armed attack, that has been diluted.
So let's just follow this a bit as to what could happen next. I'm really interested in this question of whether the Security Council is broken or not, or whether this is really a reflection of countries finding their voice. Yes, the US has not always followed the rules, and Israel also under its wing, but China and Russia haven't either, conspicuously. China over laws of the sea and other things. Russia, we can stop at Ukraine, but we don't have to. Chris, broken or mature?
Or neither.
Yeah, that is possible.
I don't think it's mature in that sense. I think that you look back to the early history of the Security Council. You had the Soviet Union vetoing. That didn't make the UN broken.
Yeah.
It still functioned fine and developed as an institution. So the uses of vetoes at the Security Council alone are not the sign of a broken system.
That's the point I was getting at. Yes.
Yeah, and as Marc mentioned at the top of this discussion, various other instances in the Security Council where you are seeing a degree of consensus. We're not in this point of global competition whereby China and Russia will automatically veto anything put forward by Western states and vice versa. It's just on those particularly sensitive issues. In a way, we're shifting into this multipolar sphere of influence view of world politics whereby the US, Russia, China draw a clear line and say this area is something we simply won't allow the UN to have any kind of authority over. In the case of the US, that's currently Israel and the Gaza conflict. In the case of places like Russia in the past, it was Syria. More recently, they've been putting vetoes in over issues around Sudan and their activities in sub-Saharan Africa. I think that behavior is going to be more common. That doesn't mean that the UN Security Council can't function on areas of consensus. It's just that the areas of consensus are going to get narrower than they were in the past.
So, Marc, where does this go? I'm going to come on to the Middle East afterwards, as I said, but where does this go with the Security Council? I sort of discourage people at Chatham House from spending certainly years of their life working on this because it is rather jammed up. But you were just floating in your last answer some sense of where you thought it healthfully could be taken.
Well, I do think that we at Chatham House should lead an effort to try to restore consensus on the underlying rules which guide when the Security Council should become active. I don't think there's much mileage in participating in the everlasting debate about Security Council reform. We will leave that to those who have conducted that debate over the last 40 years.
That is the point I had in mind. Yes, thank you, Marc.
But I think we need to recognize that underlying all of this, the Trump administration and the speech last time had one key paragraph, which was his sense that we're returning to a policy of nation states rather than multilateral cooperation, that decisions are taken according to relative power between states and their interests and their powers will determine the outcome, rather than some broader overall goal that brings states together to have a common aim. And that, I think, is a real challenge to the UN in a broader sense, not just the Security Council. You mentioned humanitarian law, where we've had huge breaches. Again, some underlying changes, the fact that non-governmental organizations control territories, ISIS has committed vast abuses and various others, rebel groups, but also major governments. Remember Russia in Grozny, now in Ukraine. The issue of Israel and its present conduct are undermining the credibility of some of those rules. Mr. Trump told us that the environment is a conspiracy. The fact that it's getting warmer around the world must be because the sun is pleased to shine longer, or whatever the reason might be, but it's not carbon emissions. So there is also a question which comes up, is the rest of the world actually going to coalesce to stand up to this and say, no, we will persist in our attempts to have multinational regulation and try to go forwards in some of these issues where, if we are honest, China, Russia also haven't always been extremely supportive, say, on the environment. But are we going to continue to lead, even the US, if the US for 4 or 8 or 12 years, depending on how long Mr. Vance will take over, will not be an eager participant? And I think that is the challenge, to motivate people not to give up and actually say, well, on trade, we actually have the WTO. It has been working pretty well. We have had rules.
And it really has. And even though it doesn't have an appeals process at the moment functioning because the US has blocked that, it's about 40 disputes go to it a year, and about half of those do get settled. It's not finished.
But they're also complied with routinely.
Yes.
It's an example where it's not the most powerful state that wins, but the state that plays by the rules wins. So are we going to stand up as a coalition of states that are actually interested in maintaining this? And the interesting thing, and that is absolutely fascinating, is that many so-called southern states have taken up the mantle. There's a coalition of states that want to defend The Hague as the place of international law for dispute settlement. You saw South Africa, the Gambia, bringing cases in the ICJ. So they are standing up to defend the system.
Absolutely they are. And we hear a lot of this at Chatham House, and it's very much what our Global Governance Centre is looking at, which is, can other countries use their voice to shape the rules that are coming? And many of them say there need to be some rules or we can't function. We're not China, we're not the US. We need to have some way to express our views on this. Chris, is it a chance for those countries, this world of flux and blockages that we're in at the moment?
Well, yes, of course there is. And exactly as Marc says, you're finding states like South Africa, states like Brazil, attempting to play a more prominent and leading role in trying to reform the global governance structures rather than abandon them. What's interesting, I suppose, is the position of European states within that dynamic. Because actually what's happening is that a lot of the time, and we've seen this with things like the ICJ in South Africa, you're getting global South states saying, we like the principles behind international law and behind sort of international global governance, but we feel like it's been Western dominated, and we want to make sure that these structures are reformed, altered, shifted to actually be fair and equal, and that means giving more of a voice to global South states. I mean, one of the things that both Brazil and South Africa have been talking about in BRICS conferences is about trying to get global institutions like the World Bank, like the WTO, to have more of a global South voice. And what's interesting is whether the European states recognize the value of this. Because on the one hand, they might be faced with a situation where they can either pick up that mantle and align themselves with global South states in contradistinction with a Trumpian America, saying actually international law is more important to us or as important to us as the transatlantic alliance. That's where things like Ukraine become a bit of an issue, because you have the heart with the European governments is with international law, it's with multilateralism, they believe in it and so on. But their head, when they're thinking about their security situation, is we're terrified of Russia, we rely on the United States to defend us in Europe and to keep supplying Ukraine, and we feel we have to placate Trump to a point in order to maintain that position. And that puts European states in a really tricky position when it comes to this question of international law, the global South. And I'm not sure which way they'll go.
So let's go finally to the question of recognizing Palestine, which is where some of these countries indeed did have their voice, and where countries, including Britain and France, decided to take the United Nations week to recognize Palestine. Marc, do you think recognizing Palestine has any effect? And if so, on who or what?
Well, let's start with what the intended effect is. It is definitely not a reward to Hamas. That argument, I think, is nonsense. This is a response.
I happen to share that, but not everyone does, including Israel, obviously.
The decision to recognize is a move trying to stop Israel from making the two-state solution absolutely impossible. And it was Israel's conduct that triggered the decision by all those reluctant states in Western Europe mainly that have thus far not recognized, finally to take the jump and do it. There is this nearly universal alliance of states for the preservation of the two-state solution that met in New York earlier in the year. And there has been really an attempt to draw the line and say that we can only foresee at the moment a way out of this mess according to what used to be the international consensus on the two-state solution. And we are unwilling to have that unilaterally destroyed. And therefore, recognizing Palestine now is probably not going to be extremely effective. It's not going to make Israel change its present policy, but it is most we can do at the moment. It's also important to, I think, show to the Arab world that the Europeans and others are taking notice of the very dramatic events and are not entirely indifferent to them. I think this entire episode will have an effect in the longer term on how the West is viewed, not having intervened more decisively in these dreadful events, which admittedly were triggered by a horrible terrorist outrage. But the principle is that however a war starts, that doesn't mean that civilians can be exposed to a brutal campaign that some claim is genocide. And therefore, I do think that recognition of Palestine is a useful step. It won't change the world from today or tomorrow, but it's at least something that could be done.
Chris, the Middle East is one of your specialities. Do you think this amounts to pressure that is going to change, say, what Israel is doing?
No, not at all. I think that it's primarily designed to express displeasure with Israel. I think there's a very strong domestic component to this, whereby in the UK certainly, but also in France and in Canada, you've got domestic pressure on the leaders to be more overtly critical of Israel's behavior. But it's also at the same time clearly recognized by those governments that this won't have the desired effect. You look at the criteria that Keir Starmer set in order to prevent this to Israel, calling a ceasefire and recognizing the two-state solution. They knew full well that wasn't going to happen, but they still set those criteria to make the impression that they're going to utilize some leverage or be able to deploy some leverage.
In your view, should they have set conditions for Hamas as well?
No, because it would be disingenuous to set conditions for Hamas because
specifically releasing the hostages.
The goal, I believe, was to recognize Palestine. If they'd set conditions on Hamas that Hamas wouldn't reach, then they wouldn't be able to recognize Palestine. So, like I say, it would be disingenuous and get themselves in quite a difficult situation. The purpose of this from a domestic political perspective for Labour and Emmanuel Macron and others was to show to be more critical of Israel. That's what its purpose was. I think inside the Middle East, aside from Israel, which is furious about the situation, most governments and most of the population, people I've spoken to, there's a bit of a shrug of the shoulders, which is a recognition that, well, we all did this years ago. You should have done it then as well, especially Britain and France having been responsible for the partition of the Middle East back in the 1920s. But there was also in this sense of, well, are you then going to do something as well as this? And that's the kind of the key point, which is I think many in Britain certainly seem to believe this is the end of it. We've been trailing. We're going to recognize Palestine. Are we going to do it? Are we not going to do it? Now we've done it. I think there's some kind of expectation that that's a full stop. It's not. Now Israel will respond in one way, perhaps annexing parts of the West Bank in fury, or perhaps just continuing the war in Gaza without any sign of a ceasefire. And it certainly doesn't seem likely to embrace the two-state solution. So what will the UK government and France and Canada do then? They'll need to find something else.
Do you think the recognition has any effect on Israeli voters who are going to face an election sometime in the next year?
That's a really interesting question. Most of the expertise on Israel suggests that most Israelis are quite disappointed with this move. There's a sizable, but nowhere near a majority of Israeli public opinion that wants a ceasefire, that wants Netanyahu to take a less aggressive perspective. But there doesn't seem to be, at this moment in time, a majority of certainly Jewish Israelis that are willing to vote for parties that actively embrace a two-state solution. There seems to be a siege mentality that's developed in Israel since the conflict has begun, and I don't think these kind of moves will affect that. The question is whether or not in the long term that might begin to shift. If over several years this, as a first move of other things, such as the EU are talking about restrictions on trade, some are talking about things like, a sports boycott, things like that. If movements like that begin to move further forward, then it's possible that might shift some Israeli public opinion. But for the short term in Gaza and even the medium term, the idea of reviving a two-state solution, it seems pretty unlikely, quite frankly.
It's hardly the last word on that. Mark, I wonder if you could take the awful spectacle of what is happening in Gaza and indeed the West Bank and the hostages who are still there, but also Ukraine, and just say, what do these two conflicts do to the sense of whether international law means anything?
Well, I think they do pose a real challenge to the credibility of international law. The World Postal Union is still delivering our letters, the newspapers, the headlines, the public perception that international law doesn't work is being deepened by this conduct.
That we're in a strongman world.
That we are in a strongman world. We are in a world where we refuse to be the strongman to uphold the law, let's say in relation to Israel-Palestine, or that we are unable to restrain the other strongman, Russia, in relation to Ukraine. That said, there has to be an outcome which in the end is going to be the result of negotiations and some sort of settlement, which we can kind of foresee what it would look like in relation to Ukraine. And we were actually not that far removed from that around April when the US put forward a set of principles for a settlement. On Palestine, much more difficult because, as we all have noted, Israel is trying to preclude a path or perspective towards a settlement through its present activities, including perhaps blaming the recognition of Palestine for undertaking further annexation, sort of saying this is our countermove, which would be disingenuous but very dangerous, also for relations with the other Abraham Accord states. So there will have to be, at some stage, negotiations. For Gaza, the real question is, how will Gaza be represented? The PLO, the Palestinian Authority, absolutely needs to be reformed. Most Palestinians say it doesn't really represent us very much. The question is, will that include some representation of a modified Hamas, a Hamas that has agreed no longer to use force?
And something that would be intolerable to Israel.
Exactly.
That is a question which I put to the Palestinian representative in London.
Certainly the Palestinian Authority, too, has to bear the weight of reforming itself. They are surprised that nobody talks to them about the future of Palestine. But the reason is that, who is there to talk to, who you can have a meaningful discussion that can be somehow implemented. And that is also a challenge for the Palestinians themselves to create that background.
It absolutely is. It actually is something, and we can draw you further into this when you arrive in Chatham House next week, but that our Middle East program is working very much on what would the future Palestinian leadership be, and something we're working very much on the ground. We're going to have to stop there. It's hardly, as I said, the last thing that what could be said on the United Nations, but we did manage some optimism there in the beginning and the middle, before perhaps getting to a slightly gloomier ending. Thank you very much for joining us. Please join me, in a sense, in thanking my two guests, Chris Phillips and Marc Weller. See you next week.